Thank you, Samantha. Good evening. Thank you all for coming here, despite of this unexpected rainy day. It's, I mean, when everyone actually of us watch what's happened in Texas and Louisiana with the actually natural crisis, it can make the difference between a man-made crisis like the Syrian crisis and natural crisis. But maybe you have a taste at least of how devastation it is and how it. At the same time, actually, just today, the COI, the Commission of Inquiry, this is international commission combined of 3 international experts, headed by Brazilian Professor Pablo Nero, commissioned by the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. And today, actually, they put their 16th report. This report, how it's important, because maybe this is the first UN report confirmed actually the use of the chemical attacks by the Assad government. Always been confirmed the use of the chemical, but they said the too many different international commissions, they said we are not responsible on actually identifying the responsible side of using the chemical weapons. This report today actually confirmed that the Assad government used the chemical weapons like the sarin gas and the chlorine gas 33 times in the last 3 years. And then what's the response? We don't see any response from the US administration or from the EU or from any of the international power. It does give you a sense that why it's important now to look into the Syrian refugee crisis from different perspectives, and this is what the title, what the need of the new strategy. Because they've been dealing with the Syrian refugees. The Syrian refugees started almost at the end of the 2011. The first refugee camp opened in Turkey in September 2011 after the attack of the city called Isra in the northern of Syria, and then the population, almost 50,000 of the population of this town, they moved into Turkey. Turkey was prepared before to open at least 6 different camps, but at that time the Prime Minister, Davutoglu, said that it's a red line to have actually 100,000 of Syrian refugees. Turkey now hosts at least 3 million Syrian refugees. That's the number, the registered number according to the UN. Of course, there is thousands of other Syrians who are refugees but are not registered in the UN list, neither in Turkey or in Lebanon or in Iraq or in other countries. Like my mother in Turkey, I have 2 brothers also in Turkey, my other sister in Jordan, and none of them registered in the UN. And this is why it's always, the crisis is bigger than the numbers that the UN or other actually international agencies can give. But from the beginning of the Syrian refugee crisis, the international community was trying to contain it. And in a way actually not to allow this international or to become an international conflict between the regional powers, between the Syrian government, Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon. And they never actually take the proper actions to stop the flee of the Syrian refugees, who's been continued to increase year by year. Maybe in the last few months we start hearing from the news that there is some few thousand they return into Syria, but we need actually to look further into these numbers, because most of those numbers is not really refugees, are more than displaced people. According to the UN, there is 6.8 million displaced inside Syria. Because of the conflict inside Syria, it's a moving conflict. It's moved from one town to other town. This is why the people keep moving from one part into other part. Even the areas who's now returned under the control of the Assad government, none of the population are actually interested, or none of the people interested to return into their homes, because the devastation in the city and the lack of the services. Like my hometown, I grew up in a town, Daraya, which is 7 kilometers south of Damascus. The population of the town of Daraya, it's 300,000 before the uprising, before 2011. Now it's a zero. No one actually live in the town anymore. And because the town was under the siege, where there is no access into water or food for almost 4 years, then some of the Free Syrian armed groups, the armed group who been in control of the city for almost 4 years, decided actually to give up and struck the deal with the Assad government and to leave into the northern part of Syria. And then the Assad government controlled the whole town, but none of interested actually to return. The town itself, which it's a small one, they got more than 40,000 barrel bombs. This is why the Stephen O'Brien, who the UN assistant called it actually the capital of the barrel bombs. The barrel bombs, it's actually indiscriminate bombs. They drop it actually, maybe some of you watch some of YouTubes, you can actually search the barrel bombs. It just dropped from helicopter or any fighter jets. It's a cheap, not expensive, and because of the government lack of any kind of sophisticated weapons, they use the barrel bombs heavily in different areas. And this is actually one of the main reasons of the flee of the Syrian refugees. And there is a poll conducted in London for the Syrian refugees in Turkey. 82% of the Syrian refugees, they said actually the main reason for them actually to leave the country because of the use of the barrel bombs. And none of the international powers, who's now Russia or the United States, tried to enforce the Assad government to stop the using of the barrel bombs. Until today, actually, there is the use of the barrel bombs continue, especially in the north and the south of Damascus. And this now the town of Daraya, back under the control of the Assad government, it's exactly the pictures or the photo exactly like a town after World War II or even more. And what the Syrian government did last week, actually, they decided they take decisions to contribute $2 million just to take off the rubbles from the town. Because that gives you a sense that the government even have any money to rebuild the town itself, or actually to accommodate the population who left the town itself. That's for the small town. Then you can actually look into the numbers of what's happening to the city of Aleppo, which Aleppo, it's the oldest city inhabited city, continuous inhabited city on earth, which have at least 5 million people before 2011, now less than 300,000 living in Aleppo. This is it's became a crisis out of management, or not only of the Syrians themselves or the Syrian government, or maybe of the international community. This is why if we need to think actually of how it can manage the Syrian crisis, first of thing, it has a political link. I know most of the UN agencies and the international organizations, they said always keep the humanitarian aspects out of politics. But this is not a natural crisis. This is a man-made crisis. And there is a political reasons and military reasons that the people are fleeing and are not interested to return into their hometown, even if there is no fighting anymore in their hometown. It's linked to the type of governance now in Syria. And still, if the type of governance continue to be in the way of torturing people, killing them by mass killings and mass enforced disappearances of political prisoners, no one will be interested to return into their own home country. The second issue, it's the international community dealt with the Syrian crisis as three different crises. We have the rise of the terrorist organizations, especially ISIS, Daesh, where the United States take most of the interest, most of the time, and the resources to eliminate ISIS in Syria and in Iraq. And the second phase of the crisis, of course, the Syrian refugees, which now became a large number. With this, none of the countries will be able to contain that number. But this is a priority for the European countries, especially Germany and other countries who hosted large number of the Syrian refugees. And the third phase of the crisis, which means a lot to the Syrians, is the Syrian transition. No one interested to think and to link actually into this, the rise of ISIS along with the Syrian refugees with the Syria transition. The Security Council 22338, which mentioned the Syria transition at the end of the Security Council resolution, never been implemented or even taken seriously. There is a Geneva talk or Astana talks by the UN and in others international donors, but there is no really pressure on the Assad government to accept any type of negotiations or in transition. And unless actually the international community understand the linkages between these three phases of the crisis, which is the rise of ISIS, you cannot actually eliminate ISIS because the whole society has been radicalized. It's been under 7 years of bombarding, 7 years of torturing and killings. The whole society has been radicalized, and that's explained how ISIS actually emerged from the ground with a large number and became the largest terrorist organizations in a few months. And the second, the flee of the Syrian refugees. Now the number of the UN, of course, of the Syrian refugees, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's 7 million. Those are the registered one. Mainly Turkey hosts the largest number of the Syrian refugees, then Lebanon, Jordan. Even Jordan now, they closed the borders almost 11 months, and no one, even the injured people, they can't go into Jordan, despite of all mediation and negotiations. But the Jordanian government refused to open the border to allow even to the injured people to get in. They said we have 800,000, that's above even our capacity and our infrastructure, and then we cannot accept any more. Then there is also the same situation in Lebanon. This large number of the Syrian refugees in the neighboring countries, and now in Europe and Egypt also host almost, in Europe itself there is at least around 1.5 million to 2 million. The large number is in Germany. Then the second country, Sweden. Germany and Sweden are hosting the large number of Syrian refugees. Those actually, if you look at, have any surveys into the Syrian refugees in Europe or in the neighboring countries, you don't see many people interested to return into the country. And of course abnormal because they have to see the conflict is over. And this is the conflict is far from being over from right now. But with the same time, they need a change in the governance. Well, that's important to link the return of the Syrian refugees into the political transition. Unless the international community focus more in enforcing the political transitions, which they mentioned in the Security Council resolution, we don't think that, of course, now maybe the United States now in the in the end stage of eliminating ISIS in Raqqa, with the capital of ISIS in Syria, but ISIS always operate as a networks under the ground. This is why maybe it can move from organization up in the into networks of cells under the ground, and they maybe can attract more people because of the international campaign. ISIS never been actually defeated militarily. ISIS has to be defeated by actually giving the future to the population of Syria and in Iraq. And this is why I don't think that the campaign that's going on in Raqqa will be able to eliminate the ISIS fighters because the fight against ISIS is not only a military fight, it's an ideological fight. And this is why you have to win the hearts of the people and prevent them from joining ISIS and other terrorist organizations by opening and giving them the future. And this is the need of actually focus more and more on the political transition. I believe that until the international community have a strategy to focus more on the Syria transition, we will not see actually an end of the Syrian refugees, which became right now less interested the media to cover it because it became a normal life, but became much more difficult for the Syrians, because we have now generation who's out of school for almost 3 years. We have actually a generations who actually lost everything in their homes, in their towns, and they don't have actually a future. They don't have any actually access to any kind of to keep them have a meaning in this life. And this is why as the attention of the media is became less and less, the crisis became more devastating to the refugees and their families day by day. I end by here, and I'm welcome actually any comments or questions. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Most of your talk covered the political reasons behind the crisis in Syria, but there was no mention of any economic factor that is coming in, because the fight between the superpowers there has got nothing to do with terrorism, but has got a lot of economic motivation. So could you address just that piece?
I think...
Because that's where the religious thing of the Shiite and the Sunni will come in.
I have the opposite argument.
Okay, go ahead.
Why the international community is not interested actually to find a solution to the Syrians themselves, because there is no such economic appetite. It's a poor country. There is no any actually interest. Look into the Kuwait, what's happening in Kuwait. Actually, the United States mobilized the international community in less than a month. And this is why it's the same thing in Iraq. The Syrians, none of the international powers, and that's reflect if you actually analyze the comments that President Obama gave, it gives you a sense that how the lefts here and the rights here agree on one thing, that we have no interest. We don't have actually no interest to go into Syria or to do anything there. And that's why the Syrians, they paying the price. One of the reasons the former President Hafez al-Assad visited North Korea in 1974. And he got actually admired by the system that Kim Jong-il built. That's huge roads, and then the population have actually to pray for their leaders, and this is something he adopted in Syria. But the most importantly, and we see now even in North Korea crisis, Syria was the only country, then actually you cannot use your Visa or MasterCard. If you can go to the Middle East, in any of the countries, even in Sudan, still under sanctions, you can use in some places your Visa and MasterCard. The former President Hafez al-Assad kept Syria actually away from the international economy and from international tourism or anything. This is why the United States or any countries has no leverage over the Assad government anyway, despite of all the envoys, despite of all the negotiations with the Assad in the first year. Even Turkey itself, Erdogan himself was actually a friend of Bashar al-Assad and sent to him his prime minister in June 2011 to convey that we are in, but you have to change the course at least. But none of the countries has leverage, and that's thanks to the type of the economic situation that the former dictator and Bashar al-Assad built, which cut any kind of leverage or networks between the international community and the small country called Syria.
Could you explain a little bit what goes into the decision of whether to register with the UN or not as a refugee?
Yes.
Because we know there are lots of unregistered.
Yes, it's because that's depends on each country. It depends on the laws of each country. As examples, in the Gulf countries, and some of here the experts always criticize the Gulf. They are rich nations. Why they don't actually host more Syrian refugees? There is no refugee law, and this is why they can't actually accept Syrians and give them actually because according to the International Convention of the Refugees, which adopted in the 50s, when you call a refugee and you register in the UN, there's a specific type of rights. You have to give it any protection. And this is why some nations, they don't want actually to give that, because it's especially the right to work, right to education, have access to education, the right not to deported, against deportation, and this is why some of the countries. In Turkey, it was different, that the government doesn't want actually to give them a refugee status, always they call them a guest, host them as a guest. Until actually 2015 and 16, they start change actually and give actually the UN access to some of the refugee camps. And this is why it depends exactly on each, in each national law where the country they have. And unfortunately in Lebanon, the same situation. And this is why it became very difficult for the Syrian refugees, especially in some countries, and that's pushed them actually to take the risk of what we call now the death boats, to take the risk actually to cross into Europe, because what we see in Europe, they will see protection. And they see actually some path into education, which none of the countries and the regional countries, they offer that to the Syrian refugees.
So from what I'm hearing from you, you're saying that you want the United States to enter Syria as like a force against the regime, right? Last thing I'm sure Syrian people want is the Trump administration coming in and turning their country into a business.
But I'm not saying that.
No, I'm saying, which is, I mean, I'm reading between the lines.
No, what I'm saying that the need of course, to link the issue of the Syrian refugees with the political transition. One of the issues, how to enforce the Syrian transition, how actually to enforce the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad to accept the transition. This is the most important issue. It's been 7 years. He rejects any kind of negotiations. He rejects actually any meaningful or serious negotiations This is why the United States and other international powers, I don't expect the United States or any actually of the countries now to go into Syria, because Syria it's a mess. And this is why the need of the international power to coordinate there. But unfortunately, the United States and Russia now, they're coordinating only against the fight of ISIS. And look to the change of the maps right now. Now the United States control most of the eastern part of Syria, like Raqqa and others, and Russia taking responsibility of Deir ez-Zor, or what we call it, the useful Syria, where there is some oil there, and some kind of actually coordination for their own benefits, rather than actually the benefits of the Syrian people, who would like actually Russia and the United States see them coordinate to enforce the transition into Syria.
Thank you so much for your insights. I'm a little puzzled by the usage of the term transition, because we usually have transition after the conclusion of the conflict and the beginning of something new. So my question is, where do you see the stage of the conflict? I mean, how much of the territory and the political process is currently controlled by Assad? Do you feel that this is the beginning of the end? Yes. And if this feels as the beginning of the end, what are the objectives of the Syrian government, the Russians? And we know that we don't know about the Americans. But where are we in the conflict? What do you think the objectives are? And if we have a transition, what would be the priorities for the Syrian government?
Yes, the maps are changing very rapidly. Before the Russian invasion, actually, in September 2012, the Syrian government controlled less than 35% of the territories of Syria. After, actually, when the Putin decided actually to step in, and he said himself that he rescued the Assad government from falling in Damascus. Now it's the Syrian government control more than actually 65%. The new player, of course, here is the Kurds. The Kurds, because the Kurds in Syria is not like in Iraq. The Iraq actually the third majority in the country. In Syria, the Kurds are between 8 to 9% only. And this is, they are not actually concentrated in the north, as in the media always focus. The majority of the Kurds are in the capital, Damascus, or in Aleppo, who's been interrogated in the society for almost years. And now being empowered by the United States, this is why the Kurds themselves control now more than 15%. And ISIS shrinking was control most of the desert of Syria, which 50%, and now they control less than 10%. This is the map, it's keep changing rapidly, and we don't know how that depends on actually the compromise between the United States and Russia. And now we see new, let's say, a new equation that the United States is accepting that the Russians can take some of the parts in the eastern part of Syria, like Deir ez-Zor, which now most of the news focus on the Deir ez-Zor, because they're allowing the Syrian government to come from the south into the north to control. That was impossible 2 years ago. It gives you a sense how the Russians became a change player and a game changer. And this is why nobody knows what's inside Putin's mind. If he will continue actually to do this, but then his dream, or the Assad government dream, to control Syria as it was, well, this is something impossible. And we know actually the Russian economy is not strong enough to be able to rebuild Syria, and this is why something that the Russians are very reluctant, and they need actually to bring the United States and other powers on board to be able to contribute in the build later on. This is what my short answer. It's a very complicated. Even for the Syrians, to understand how is the end game will be. what we understand and we're pushing right now, it has to be a transition. A transition. It can be smooth and peaceful, like what's happened in Tunisia after the Arab Spring in 2011. Have very smooth transition from dictatorship, one ruling party, constitutional party, into a democratic and have pluralism and an election. And unfortunately, in the case in Syria, it's very bloody. At least 500,000 now lost their lives. And we have more than 300,000 disappeared. Nobody knows exactly where they are. And this is why our understanding the transition that it became very bloody, as I said, and complicated. And this is why the need of the international power to come up with a grand strategy to link all the issues, not focus only on ISIS or on the Syrian refugees, but how actually can we bring the country together again?
Thank you, Dr. Ziada. I'm not going to address the issue in Syria particularly because I'm from Damascus, so I know the insights of everything you mentioned. My interest is focused more on refugees, is the title of the topic that you're planning to discuss today. I'm actually doing a research on refugees' identity reformation. In my understanding that you will be addressing a strategy in how to reform these refugees, I'm going to look at it from a smaller scale. Let's consider refugees in the United States. How can individuals and people on my level, or any one of us sitting in this room, can contribute and do something to help assimilate these refugees and help them facilitate adaptation into this culture? This is something that I'd like to hear something about strategy that you were mentioning in your email.
Yeah, thank you very much actually for your question. Right. The United States used to be actually the largest recipients of refugees. The United States hosts more than 90,000 Iraqi refugees after the war in Iraq, and the same and less number on the Balkans during the war. But unfortunately, on the Syrian crisis, it's lack of leadership. I'm not talking about the Trump, of course, but before the Trump itself, actually, we don't saw any kind of leadership from the Obama administration itself. The Obama pledged to have 20,000 Syrian refugees, and barely actually they made it into the last month of the Obama administration, which was January. Now with the new version of the executive order, the whole program of the Syrian refugees has been stopped or held because of the executive order of the Trump administration. And now the need of actually to integrate the Syrian refugees here in the United States into. I visited many of the families of the Syrian refugees in New York, in Michigan, and in Virginia. Of course, they're coming into two different culture and society, where they lack of skills, lack of understanding from the financial system into the educational system. This is why they need sympathy from our society, from the communities. And most of actually the areas I visited, I surprised how there is actually some kind of sympathy with the Syrian refugees. And you can hear hundreds of stories from the Syrian refugees, how actually the ordinary American citizens, they host them and they helping them. And they actually trying to help in any way possible to integrate them into the society. This is why you see a lot of actually a good thing within the society, but the need actually how can reflect into the political leadership to actually to enforce or at least to push the Trump administration to host or to accept more Syrian refugees. There was a line in the USA actually or the Washington Post, I believe, 3 months ago, that Ivanka Trump, the daughter of President Trump, she's lobbying maybe for the United States to accept more Syrian refugees. I'm not sure if it's true or not, but at least that it can be has an impact, because one of the lines that the candidate Trump was attacking the Syrian refugees during the campaign. And it was, as Syrians and myself Syrian, we felt very actually offended by how it's a false news. He's been attacking the Syrian refugees actually as the one who's coming here to invade the country, or actually to do some tourist activities, or this not actually, the Syrian refugees actually escaping the terrorist organizations and terrorist regime they have in Syria to find a better life and better education. This is why what's important to focus on the good side of the American society in hosting the Syrian refugees, and trying actually to make the pressure on the Congress to increase the number of the Syrian refugees, and for the United States actually to be a leader back in hosting. We can make the comparison now between the Prime Minister of Canada, Trudeau, who's actually received the Syrian refugees at the airport, or Angela Merkel actually, who put all her credibility online because continue to defend that it was the right decision in 2015 to accept more Syrian refugees. And this is the political capital, unfortunately, the United States is losing right now. And I think this is why our role here to continue pushing for the United States to show its leadership on this side.